Good evening, everybody. I'm Sarah Kelly Oler, and I'm the Field McCormick Chair and Curator of Arts of the Americas and Vice President of Curatorial Strategy here at the Art Institute. And I'm also the organizing curator of the museum's presentation of Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist, and all that it implies. And it's truly my honor to welcome you here tonight, and I'll add a quick reminder to please silence your cell phones. In tonight's lecture, My Two Peoples, Elizabeth Catlett's Activism in Mexico, Melanie Herzog will explore the ways in which, over the course of more than a half century in Mexico, Catlett developed a praxis of printmaking as a democratizing medium. She embraced the expressive potential of sculptural form, and she sustained her commitment to the African American and Mexican communities that she called My Two Peoples, or both her peoples. This lecture tonight is made possible by the Frank J. Mooney Memorial Fund. And I'm really, truly delighted to introduce Melanie Herzog tonight. I have long admired her scholarship, and for many years, I've been grateful for her generosity and warmth as both a friend and a colleague. Melanie is Professor Emerita of Art History at Edgewater College in Madison, Wisconsin. She's currently a lecturer in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she received her MFA in ceramics and a PhD in art history. With an emphasis on artists' encounters across cultural and geographic borders, on socially engaged artistic practice, and on the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, and representation, she teaches, publishes, and lectures widely on the art and visual culture of North America and the African diaspora. Her publications include the extraordinarily important Elizabeth Catlett, an American artist in Mexico, which was published in 2000, and numerous essays, and that includes most recently an essay called Thinking About Women, Form, Substance, and Radical Politics, which appears in the exhibition catalog for the exhibition on view at the Art Institute now. So please join me in welcoming Melanie Herzog to the Art Institute. Melanie?
Good evening, and thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you to Sarah Kelly Oler for inviting me to speak to you this evening, and to Sarah, to Miguel Perez, and everyone at the Art Institute of Chicago who worked to make this event happen. I am honored to be here. This exhibition, Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist, and all that it implies, that's now on view here at the Art Institute, is such a brilliant invitation to think through the lens of art about what happens at the intersection of art and activism when an artist's vision, lived experience, identities and affinities, cultural practices, passions, and social commitments come together to create a life lived as a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. A Black revolutionary artist who felt profound empathy for and solidarity with both her peoples, Mexican and African American. When Elizabeth Catlett first traveled to Mexico in 1946, she was 31 years old. A year later, she moved to Mexico permanently. She joined the Taller de Gráfica Popular, the People's Printmaking Workshop, which is abbreviated TGP, which was Mexico's most politically active artists collective. At the end of the 1950s, she was hired as the first woman professor of sculpture at Mexico's National Autonomous University. She became a renowned artist, an educator, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother, a Black feminist, and a transnational solidarity activist. She lived and worked in Mexico for more than 60 years, where she developed a praxis of printmaking as a democratizing medium and as a sculptor, embracing the expressive potential of form and materials. And her primary subjects and her audiences were, as she said, my two peoples. But none of this had happened yet when she arrived in Mexico for the first time. My focus this evening is Elizabeth Catlett's art and activism in Mexico, but we need to think about what she brought with her, the experiences, politics, and radical empathy that shaped how she experienced Mexico's art scene and the socially engaged artists community of the TGP, and the expressions of transnational solidarity that pervade her art and her activism. She grew up in the early decades of the 20th century in Washington, D.C., and was instilled with an awareness of the oppression of African Americans and a fierce sense of justice. Her mother, who was educated as a teacher, worked as a truant officer in Washington's public schools. Her father, who had been a professor of mathematics at Tuskegee Institute, died several months before her birth. One of her grandmothers lived with the family, and she remembered hearing both of her grandmother's memories of enslavement. Her undergraduate years at Howard University brought her into the center of current debates on modernism, aesthetics, and the sources to which African American artists should look for artistic inspiration. After graduation, she taught for 2 years in the public schools in Durham, North Carolina, and then she decided to go to graduate school with the aim of teaching art at the college level. At the University of Iowa from 1938 until 1940, she studied with the painter and printmaker Grant Wood, who famously instructed her to take as her artistic subject something, he said, that you know the most about. She changed her emphasis to sculpture and graduated in 1940 with the first Master of Fine Arts degree earned in sculpture from the University of Iowa, but Grant Wood's teaching remained significant. Here is her MFA thesis carving in limestone with the solidly interlocked forms of mother and child that she described in her written thesis as so interlaced as to be expressive of maternity and so compact as to be suitable to stone. And this characterized her depictions of maternity throughout her career. You're also seeing a model for this sculpture and the cover, the front page of her master's thesis. She taught for 2 years at Dillard University in New Orleans, and between her first and second years at Dillard, she spent the summer here in Chicago. She made prints at the recently opened Southside Community Art Center and studied ceramics here at the Art Institute. This was the height of the Chicago Renaissance, and she immersed herself in the lively and politically leftist art scene of Chicago's South Side. Sarah Kelly Oler's brilliant essay in the catalog for the exhibition will give you lots more information about this formative time for Elizabeth Catlett. She moved to New York in 1942 with her husband at the time, Charles White, who she had met in Chicago. She worked in the studio of the Russian sculptor Osip Zadkine, who had recently arrived as a refugee from the Nazi occupation of France. Zadkine's example impelled her to experiment, as you see here, with modernist abstraction, which she said enabled her to understand how African abstraction conveys meaning through form. She also made prints at the Art Students League. From 1944 until her departure from Mexico 2 years later, she served as an instructor and the promotion director at the George Washington Carver People's School, a night school for working people in Harlem. She said that what she learned from her students about how their economic circumstances shaped their lives solidified her awareness of the privileges afforded her by her education. And she said she was inspired by what she termed the cultural hunger of the women she worked with at the Carver School to make art that made their lived experiences visible and that spoke to their aspirations as well as the hardship they experienced. In 1945, she was awarded a Julius Rosenwald Fund Fellowship to produce what she wrote about in her fellowship application, which was a series of lithographs, paintings, and sculptures on the role of the Negro woman in the fight for democratic rights in the history of America. And when her funding was renewed for a second year, she and Charles White went to Mexico. Many artists and writers from the United States were attracted during the 1930s and the 1940s to Mexico, the post-revolutionary atmosphere of social and economic reform, the inexpensive cost of living, and the proliferation of art in multiple forms. Mexican painters adorned the walls of Mexico City's public spaces with murals, often paid for by the Mexican government in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. These murals illuminated Mexican people's history and culture. Printmakers made woodcuts, linoleum cuts, and lithographs that manifested pride in Mexico's indigenous roots, class consciousness, and nationalistic fervor, and addressed social and political issues of immediate concern. These prints, many of which were made by the artists of the TGP, and reproductions of murals circulated widely among socially engaged artists in the United States. Mexican painters and printmakers, too, traveled to the United States and exhibited and made work here. So Catlett was well aware of this cultural and political milieu when she chose to spend her second Rosenwald year in Mexico. She intended to spend a year in Mexico City, studying sculpture and working as a guest artist at the Taller de Gráfica Popular. You're seeing terracotta works from this time, and pensive, which was later cast in bronze. But plans change. After several months, she returned to the United States to end her marriage to Charles White, and then went back to Mexico in 1947 to establish permanent residence. Her decision to make her home in Mexico was, in part, a response to the US government's increasingly vicious attacks on progressive artists, intellectuals, and activists following the end of World War II. Many leftist US artists and writers relocated to Mexico as the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC, commenced its investigations of suspected communists who faced ruthless questioning, loss of employment, and imprisonment. She also repeatedly asserted that she found relief in Mexico from the daily occurrences of racism that she had experienced in the United States. She found a community of artists at the TGP whose aims were in accord with hers, and she fell in love with one of these artists, Francisco Mora. They married in 1947 and were married for nearly 55 years until Mora's death in 2002. For Elizabeth Catlett and other US artists in Mexico at the mid-20th century, some who visited for a short time and some who stayed, the TGP and more broadly, Mexico's post-revolutionary leftist artistic community offered an affirming space for the artistic expression of their political convictions. By the end of the 1940s, she was a member of the TGP, which had been founded in 1937 by a group of progressive and radical printmakers to produce immediately and publicly accessible political commentary in print form on current issues and historical events. In its first decade, the decade before she got there, the workshop produced tens of thousands of images, mostly black and white linoleum cuts, some woodcuts, and lithographs that condemned fascism, supported unions and national literacy programs and other forms of popular education, movements for social justice, and honored Mexico's history, particularly Mexican people's history. TGP prints were printed by the thousands on thin newsprint quality paper, distributed in portfolios and pasted on walls, as you see in the print here, and they were sold inexpensively throughout Mexico and internationally. The print that you see in the center is by Francisco Mora, Elizabeth Catlett's husband, starting in 1947. When she arrived in Mexico, the TGP's major project was their epic Prints of the Mexican Revolution, Estampas de la Revolución Mexicana, a portfolio of 85 linoleum cuts that commemorates the heroes and martyrs of the Mexican Revolution in dramatic, expressive realist images, accompanied by narrative titles and explanatory text. You're seeing several of these prints here. Many of them were based on well-known photographs. This grand narrative of people's history was a model for Catlett's Negro Woman print series, later retitled The Black Woman. The entire series is on view in the current exhibition, which is fabulous. It consists of 15 intimately scaled linoleum cuts, accompanied by captions that prescribe the order in which the prints should be seen. Throughout the series, the historically marginalized achievements of African American heroines and the private realities of the lives of ordinary African American women demand witness. The titles, beginning with "I am the Black woman," invite us to identify with her subject, even if we ourselves are not Black women. I am. We repeat as we read these titles, joining the artist in her identification with her subject through this insistent first-person declaration of a Black woman's subjectivity given voice throughout the series narrative. Photographs produced for the US government's Farm Security Administration and published in Richard Wright's and Edwin Roscom's 1941 book, 12 Million Black Voices, A Folk History of the Negro in the United States, were sources for several of the prints, emulating the TGP's practice of borrowing from well-known photographs. The subject and setting for I Have Always Worked Hard in America recalls this photograph by Jack Delano. In the Fields, the image of the sharecropper and her surroundings is drawn from one of Dorothea Lange's photographs documenting rural life in the US South. The series honors historical figures. Sojourner Truth is based on a frequently reproduced engraving of the abolitionist leader. In Harriet Tubman, I Helped Hundreds to Freedom, invokes African-American artist Jacob Lawrence's narrative series of paintings, also accompanied by text, on Harriet Tubman's life and courageous acts, and it invokes prints by German expressionist artist Käthe Kollwitz, whose work Catlett admired. Phyllis Wheatley is drawn from the frontispiece by Scipio Moorhead for Phyllis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Wheatley was the first person of African descent and only the third woman in colonial America whose poetry was published in print form. In this series, Elizabeth Catlett invokes Black women's steadfast endurance, courageous activism, and the weight of the burdens they carry. It's a declaration of solidarity with union organizers and women who hunger for education. Working women of the US South, whose lives were made immensely more difficult by segregation, where they could travel, where they could sit on public transportation. Exhausted women in New York, Chicago, and other northern US cities who faced overcrowded living conditions in special houses. We see a backdrop of tenement housing seen in Russell Lee's photograph of segregated housing in Chicago, published in 12 Million Black Voices. The lynching Catlett depicted in And a Special Fear for My Loved Ones conveys Black women's fear for the safety of those they love, an unrelenting fear. The final image in the series is My Right is a Future of Equality with Other Americans. She immersed herself in life in Mexico. She was absorbed in the workings of the TGP. She was married to a Mexican artist. She was raising 3 sons in the heart of Mexico City. The TGP was her social and artistic home, where her politics and her social concerns were validated and her artistic practice flourished as she adopted the workshop's collaborative process, graphic style, and visual politics of protest and witness. She made prints at the workshop in the evenings and did her best to attend Friday night meetings where new projects were initiated and prints produced individually and collaboratively were critiqued. Organizations such as unions and agricultural workers' associations would send representatives to these meetings with requests for graphic images to support their struggles, and TGP members worked together to produce prints that would most effectively convey the desired message. An example of that collaborative process is this large-scale two-sheet linoleum cut designed by Catlett and rendered by fellow TGP member Alberto Beltran to publicize the first National Peace Congress held in Mexico City in May of 1951. It's a magnificent print in the Art Institute's collection, and it's on view in the exhibition. Her similarly themed linoleum cut, El Pueblo Mexicano en las Filas de la Paz, or The Mexican People in the Ranks of Peace, depicts a rural and urban Mexican worker joined in anti-militarist unity. Note in both of these images the outstretched hands holding back the weapons of war. The second image appeared in 1956 on the cover of Paz, the newsletter of the Mexican Peace Organization of the same name. As a foreigner living in Mexico, Catlett had to be cautious about political involvements that could result in her deportation. But she chose to work with this peace group and was responsible for cover design and layout for the group's newsletters. In 1950 or early 1951, outraged and deeply moved by the plight of striking miners and their families in the north of Mexico, Catlett collaborated with two longtime members of the TGP, Leopoldo Mendez and Pablo O'Higgins, on this silkscreen poster to garner support for the miners whose strike had been declared illegal. She told me she worked on it with those two. I know that the exhibition lists an additional member of the workshop who participated in this as well. Strike leaders were jailed, and many workers lost their jobs. As the miners marched from northern Mexico to Mexico City, where they established an encampment and awaited a resolution, the TGP produced print materials in solidarity with their struggle. Mexico got into me, Catlett said of those years. Emblematic of her increasingly transnational visual politics and her sense of identity, increasingly Mexican as well as African American, the prints she made as a member of the TGP illuminate the realities of Mexican people's lives and, as we've seen, resistance to US aggression throughout Latin America. Alphabetización, or literacy, celebrates the Mexican government-sponsored literacy campaigns of the 1940s. Pan, or bread, also titled The Right to Eat, asserts the right of bodily sustenance for all people. In prints like these, she modeled her subjects with the subtle range of tonality seen in the work of the TGP's most technically accomplished printmakers. Her prints from this time also bear witness to ongoing efforts by African Americans for civil rights and self-determination, sometimes with iconography drawn from her Mexican context. Her linoleum-cut Civil Rights Congress of 1949 commemorates this body's highly visible challenges to institutionalized racism. The following year, the Civil Rights Congress would bring a petition to the United Nations charging the United States with genocide. The calavera, or skeleton figure, is a familiar trope of social critique in Mexican visual culture. Here, robed as a member of the Ku Klux Klan and menacing the seated child, it's restrained by William Patterson, the National Executive Secretary of the Civil Rights Congress. Sharecropper, or cosechadora de algodón, is one of her most celebrated linoleum cuts, first a black and white print, and she also experimented with color in some early proofs. And you can see how her incising of the linoleum block for Sharecropper reflects the fluency that she developed in this medium at the TGP. At the same time, the angularity of the woman's careworn face marks Sharecropper as kin to her earlier depictions of African American women's workers. With images like these, she deliberately countered racist stereotypes and misinformation about African Americans seen all too often in US and US-dominated Mexican media. Her commitment to the illumination of African American history as an expression of transnational solidarity is exemplified by the print series Against Discrimination in the US that she organized at the TGP in 1953. She provided images and information about these historical figures as she educated her fellow printmakers about Black history. There are 16 prints in the series based on engravings and photographs of important historic figures, from Revolutionary War martyr Crispus Attucks to Reconstruction-era Mississippi Senator Blanche K. Bruce, agricultural scientist George Washington Carver, and the actor, singer, athlete, and activist Paul Robeson. Some of these are on view in the current exhibition. Catlett contributed the image of Harriet Tubman based on a frequently reproduced 19th century engraving. The series was never published. It was supposed to be a supplement for the newspaper called Freedom that Paul Robeson was publishing, but it was exhibited worldwide. She also contributed to the TGP's expansion of the Prints of the Mexican Revolutionary portfolio on the theme of Mexican history. It was expanded as 450 Years of Struggle, Homage to the Mexican People, published in 1960. Her print, The People's Contribution to the Nationalization of the Petroleum Industry, is based on her husband Francisco Mora's earlier print for the Mexican Revolution portfolio, but in hers, women and children are central. Catlett said that raising children was the most creative thing she could imagine doing, and that motherhood enriched her art making. In Mis Hijos, or My Sons, she depicted her 3 young sons playing with the masks used to celebrate Mexico's Day of the Dead. As a mother, she said she discovered commonalities in the experiences of Mexican and African American working class women and women living in poverty, and this consciousness is reflected in her prints and sculpture. While her children were small, Catlett set sculpture aside because she didn't have the time and space necessary for this work. But when she took her youngest son to kindergarten, she returned to the sculpture studio at La Esmeralda, the government-run art school where she had studied with the sculptor Francisco Zúñiga during her initial months in Mexico. She began to work again in clay and in wood, studying with the sculptor José L. Ruiz. She returned, too, to the theme of motherhood in sculptures that depict the physicality of maternity, the endurance of mothers, their fierce determination to protect their children, and their anguish when they cannot. There's profound tenderness in these paired figures, too. In 1959, she was hired as the first woman professor of sculpture in Mexico's oldest and most prestigious art academy, the Escuela Nacional de Artes Plásticas, or National School of Fine Arts, at Mexico's National Autonomous University, where she taught until 1975. While her male colleagues initially opposed her appointment, she gained their respect, and she taught 4th and 5th year sculpture at the National University until 1975. Many of her students became well-known artists in Mexico. Comparing her sculptures to her prints, she said, "I thought of sculpture as more durable and timeless, something with emotion and the relation between form and emotion." The figures, mostly women, that she sculpted manifest her engagement with the expressive potential of form and the tactile sensuality of her materials. Her figures are simultaneously informed by African and pre-encounter or pre-Hispanic Mexican sources, more recent Mexican sculpture, and modernist abstraction, which she consistently pointed out has roots in African sculpture. Whether they're intimately scaled or life-size or monumental, they take up and hold space. She was disciplined and passionate about the physical properties of her materials, and she handled these materials in ways that emphasize their substantive nature and enhance their forms. The plasticity of clay is evident in her terracotta figures, and she often investigated an idea or an image through clay models, which she sometimes cast in bronze, before committing herself to the more arduous work of carving and finishing larger pieces. When she carved wood, Mexican primavera, Spanish cedar, and mahogany, she said, "I'm guided by the beauty in the configuration of the material. When I use wood, for example, I might exaggerate the form to bring out a little more of the grain of the wood. I like to finish sculpture to the maximum beauty attainable from the material from which it is created." Carving in stone, she was mindful of the roughness, sheen, or translucency of different types of stone, limestone, onyx, and marble, as she carved rounded volumes, sharply delineated planes, and nested interior concave spaces and openings within her more abstract pieces. Her choice of materials was in part determined by their availability. Trees cut down in her neighborhood, limestone left over from building projects, and she also valued the rich variety of materials available to sculptors in Mexico. Her figures are sanded and polished smooth, and they're kind of satiny, shiny, luminous, glowing sometimes from within. What mattered to her was how the expressive potential of form, what she called form that achieves sympathy, could be manifested through the elegance of a turn, the interplay of concave and convex form, the simplification of forms to their essential components, poses or gestures that convey exhaustion, resilience, dignity, tenderness, joy, gathering strength from within. That's what spoke to her. She was moved, she said, not by the female nudes of the European artists, but by the women of the African woodcarvers and the pre-Hispanic stone carvers. Along with looking to these sources, she said, I use my own body in working. When I'm bathing or dressing, I see how my body looks and moves. I never do sculpture from a nude model. Mostly, I watch women. African sculpture was a primary source of inspiration, and Black women were her primary subject. And some of her sculptures represent clearly Mexican subjects. The rebozo, or shawl, was a signifier, or is a signifier, of indigenous Mexican identity, and we see here two representations. The seated figure called rebozo of 1957, carved in Mexican limestone, sits in her garden in Cuernavaca. She kept this piece throughout her life, moving it to her final home and studio when she retired from teaching. Like other US leftist expatriates in Mexico, Catlett was subjected intermittently to harassment by the United States Embassy throughout the 1950s. Her decision to seek Mexican citizenship came after she was forcibly taken from her home by Mexican authorities and imprisoned as a foreign agitator during a railroad workers' strike in 1959. Her arrest and the arrests of many other people were part of a move by the Mexican and US governments to suppress labor and the left, as the Mexican government forces brutally attacked trade unionists and arrested and deported many US citizens living in Mexico, who the US Embassy designated as communist. After her release from prison, she applied for Mexican citizenship to avoid further mistreatment and possible deportation. She became a Mexican citizen in 1962 and was immediately labeled an undesirable alien by US authorities because of her political affinities. As a Mexican citizen, she could engage in a broader range of political activity without risk of deportation. In 1963, she was among 91 Mexican women who traveled to post-revolution Cuba to attend the Congress of Women in the Americas. She was impressed with Cuba's emphasis on education and racial integration, in contrast to the anti-integration violence in her country of origin. The Mexican delegation returned to form the National Union of Mexican Women, dedicated to fighting for the rights of Mexican working class and peasant women. She served on the organization's board until 1975. Her 1962 linoleum cut, There Is No School, addresses the impact of lack of access to education, which was a concern for this activist coalition. The year after she went to Cuba, she carved Mujer, or Woman, an emphatic proclamation of solidarity with women across national boundaries. You can see that the forms of this substantial and sensuous figure are generalized, with only essential details depicted. The subtly curved planes of the face evoke skin stretched over bone, as well as multiple African and Mexican mask traditions. The sculpture's surface is sanded and polished to a satiny sheen. Her sturdy stance, open pose, and serene upturned face convey confidence, strength, and aspiration. Mujer is now in the permanent collection of Mexico City's Museum of Modern Art, and it was awarded a purchase prize in Mexico's second National Sculpture Biennial in 1964. Her Olmec bather is decidedly Mexican and African, an assertion of the longtime African presence on Mexico's Atlantic coast, beginning with what she termed the mother culture of Mexico, the Olmec culture that preceded the arrival of the Spanish by at least 2,000 years. Here's her description of this 10-foot tall sculpture installed at the Cultural Center at the Polytechnic Institute in Mexico City. She said, "It's a tall woman with a big bust and a big behind, and she's got a floating towel around her. I called it Olmec because it has black features, and those were black people in Mexico, despite what many anthropologists say. The Olmec culture was the mother culture of Mexico, and when you have a 14-foot head with black features, there's no way of saying that black people weren't here then. I called it a bather because it was a nude, and I called it Olmec because it had black features." The impact of Mexico on her representation of black women is evident in The Black Woman Speaks from 1971, modeled on the singing head that she regarded as Mexican. Its form was derived from pre-encounter sculptures from Veracruz on the Atlantic coast of Mexico. She recognized these cross-cultural convergences in her sculpture, noting that her images of African Americans often look Mexican. She said, "A woman critic here, referring to Raquel Thibault in Mexico, once told me that whenever I do Mexicans in sculpture, they always turn out to be black. There's no doubt a lot of truth in what she said. My art does, after all, speak for both my peoples." Although she was prohibited from traveling to the United States throughout the 1960s, from her vantage point in Mexico, she refocused her attention on movements for justice here, and she shared with revolutionary Black artists in the US what she had learned in Mexico about art making as a praxis of solidarity activism. She felt a profound connection to the promise of Black nationalism and the visual politics of the Black arts movement, and she proclaimed her political affinities in iconic prints such as Malcolm X Speaks for Us and Black is Beautiful, with explicit reference to US Black political leaders and organizations such as the Black Panthers. Many of her prints and sculpture from these years affirmed her solidarity with the civil rights and Black power movements and emphasized the role of women in these movements. In another evocation of Black power, in Black Unity, she borrowed from several African sculptural sources. She didn't replicate any of these, but the paired faces that are subtly differentiated are simultaneously reminiscent of multiple sources, including Cuba cups and the baule masks that influenced many of her elegantly carved faces, evidence of her interest in the expressive and evocative potential of African sculptural form rather than in cultural specificity. Her homage to my young Black sisters is an eloquent declaration of her solidarity with the defiant young women of the Black Power movement. The figure's raised arm and clenched fist, a gesture of protest that was broadcast around the world during the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968, demands witness for women's role in movements for Black liberation. That fist carries upward the energy of the body's central cavity, and it's also a gesture of radical empathy rooted in bodily experience. For that concave opening space is a womb space and a heart space, and Catlett transforms its energy into dynamic activism. She envisioned placing a heart, a carved shape of a heart, within this cavity, but decided not to. Perhaps she concluded that this woman's heart, her commitment to justice for her people, cannot be bound within this physical space. And while it's difficult to see, the figure does have a face. It's carved in shallow relief and turned to the sky. In 1970, Angela Davis was arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder after guns that belonged to her were used in an armed takeover of a California courtroom and 4 people were killed. Photographs of this revolutionary Black Power activist were published in Life magazine and other popular magazines. These photographs were repurposed for posters and other materials by activists around the world, including Catlett, who led the Mexican campaign to free Angela Davis, free all political prisoners. Her screen print, Angela Libre, uses pop art as well as the style of contemporary political graphics to call for her release from prison. Political Prisoner, a life-size sculpture in the exhibition, also references Angela Davis. Her hands are handcuffed behind her back, which you can see when you go see it. Angela Davis was acquitted of the charges against her in 1972. For Catlett, addressing the reality of trauma, as well as resistance and threats to the well-being of Black people, was a necessity, grounded in history and the urgency of the time. In Target, sometimes called Target practice, she repurposed an earlier sculpture by adding a rifle sight. This is one of several works from the late 1960s and early 70s in which she condemned the violence and police brutality that racked urban Black communities in the United States and spaces of resistance to oppression in Latin America. In The Torture of Mothers, the young victim of violence is encapsulated in a jagged-edged, red pod-like form that literally fills his mother's head. She drew this image from a photograph published on the cover of Life magazine in 1967 of a 12-year-old boy who was playing in the street and was felled by police violence. The weighty solidity of the woman's profile evokes those colossal stone heads carved by indigenous Olmec sculptors. For Catlett, a link between ancient African and indigenous Mexican people that extends the torture of mothers to encompass Black and brown mothers across national divides who fear for their children's safety. And it asserts the right transnationally of well-being for children whose safety is under constant systemic threat. Mother and child is another impassioned image of maternal protection, the child enfolded within the mother's abstracted torso, that in sculptural form conveys the anguish of mothers who can't protect their children from harm. A similar sculpture to this one is in the exhibition. Catlett knew women whose children were felled by the military forces called out against student protesters in Mexico City in 1968. Her own sons had been part of these mass demonstrations. She identified with mothers in the US who lived in fear that their young Black sons would be next, and with women in Latin America whose children were disappeared by US-supported government forces that opposed their people's liberation movements. Despite her expatriate status, she had not been forgotten in the United States. As a younger generation of Black artists claimed her as a foremother, her work found renewed visibility. A 1970 article in Ebony magazine, My Art Speaks for Both My Peoples, featured her sculptural practice and her cross-cultural affinities. One photo caption reads in part, "Armed with power tools and chisels, Miss Catlett begins the liberation of another of her figurative Black sisters imprisoned in a log." She's characterized as among Mexico's finest printmakers, and her role as an educator is underscored. And this article was followed by numerous invitations to exhibit her work in the US after nearly 25 years' absence. In 1970, she was invited to attend the Conference on the Functional Aspects of Black Art held at Northwestern University as an advisor and an elder of distinction. The US Embassy denied her a visa to attend the conference, so she spoke by phone from Mexico. And her statement was an unequivocal affirmation of her solidarity with the Black liberation struggle and the revolutionary potential of art. She also asserted her profound identification with the liberatory vision and praxis of her fellow Mexican artists that she offered as an example for her listeners. This is the speech from which the title of the current exhibition is derived, and I'll read a bit of it. Unfortunately for me, I was refused a visa on the grounds that as a foreigner, there was a possibility that I would interfere in social or political problems, and thus I constituted a threat to the well-being of the United States. To the degree and the proportion that the United States constitute a threat to Black people, to that degree and more do I hope to have earned that honor. For I have been and am currently and always hope to be a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies. She went on, She went on, I am married to a Mexican artist and I am a Mexican citizen by choice, but I cannot nor would I wish to escape the fact that I am also an American-born and reared Black woman artist. And she concluded, I want to say a final word about the love we should have for our Black brothers and sisters, to live with them, learn from them, create from them, and give to them of our art only the best. Our people deserve no less. Let's create the best art possible for the liberation of our beautiful Black people. This was the impetus for her 1970 solo exhibition at Mexico City's Museum of Modern Art, Experiencia Negra, Escultura y Grabado de Elizabeth Catlett, a show of 16 sculptures and 12 prints. And you see here a photograph of her at the opening reception along with several of the prints. She said, I want to let the Mexican people know how Blacks seek to establish their dignity, their self-respect. I feel that it is appropriate for me to express my Black experience in Mexico in the same way that I would relate my Mexican experience in the United States. And she had the opportunity to express her Black experience and her Mexican experience in the following year in a solo exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem. It was an exhibition of 15 sculptures and 22 prints, her first major solo show in the United States since 1948, and you're seeing some of the exhibited works here. A concerted effort led by the director of the Studio Museum and supported by numerous other African-American artists, forced the US State Department to grant her a visa to attend the opening, though she was not permitted to travel freely in the United States. This exhibition, along with the 1970 Ebony article, solidified her status in the United States as a prominent and revolutionary Black artist. It was the first of many that were held at predominantly Black institutions in the United States, universities, libraries, in community centers during the 1970s and in subsequent decades. In 1975, the Mexican painter and printmaker Rufino Tamayo claimed that truly revolutionary painting takes new stylistic paths and that the utilization of social or political content to call one's art revolutionary is meaningless. After Tamayo's statement was published in a Mexico City newspaper, Catlett wrote a response in which she argued that Mexican murals and what she termed social printmaking were revolutionary precisely because of their content. She summarized the core values and commitments that shaped her art practice and her belief in the transformative potential of art when she wrote that artists have a powerful obligation to expose abuses of power and the perpetuation of injustice, illuminate resistance, and stimulate revolutionary awareness in service to social transformation. Art cannot effect this change, she concluded, but it can raise consciousness of the necessities and possibilities for doing so. I have some examples here of some of her later work that I'm going to go through very quickly. You can see them in the exhibition. I want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. So my apologies for going through these rather quickly. You can see how in her sculpture she drew upon a range of forms of expression to convey feeling. You see abstraction in her figurative work, always in the service of meaning. One of these two figures of the mother and child is on view in the exhibition, the one from 1983. It's a little bit smaller. And I wanted you to see these examples of these works in progress. Her US citizenship was restored in 2002, and she spent her last years as a citizen of both the United States and Mexico. By the end of her life, she had received major commissions, several honorary degrees, and numerous honors, as well as opportunities to exhibit in major museums and galleries. She would have been so gratified by her current exhibition and gratified by it being here, which celebrates her art and her activism as a revolutionary artist and all that it implies. Thank you.